So, welcome back to our series, Heaven, Who Goes There? And as Matt shared, we're coming to the end of the series today. I don't quite know what it's like in your home and in your family, but in our home there is someone who makes all the rules. Okay? And this member of the family makes it very clear that they expect their rules to be listened to, and sometimes they want an immediate response. And I have to admit that for me, sometimes it's a little bit frustrating. You know, if I'm working, if I'm busy with sermon prep or so, and I have to stop what I'm doing because this family member wants attention, it can just be a little bit annoying. But because we're a family, is a member of the family, we kind of accept it, and we have a choice. But there's another reason for it. How can anyone resist such a lovable member of the family? Okay, if truth be told, he's got us completely wrapped around his, well, not so small paw. Okay, yeah, he gets away with just about everything. Now, in our family, when our children were growing up, they are now grown-ups, and so the dynamics have obviously changed. But as they were growing up in those early days, like most families, like probably your family, we had some sets of rules of what was expected and not expected. The interesting part is that when we got married, Jill and I didn't go, you know, we got such a good set of home rules, I think we need some kids, okay? Let's have some kids so that we can apply these rules to somebody. Okay, so let's have some children. Now, just keep that thought in mind, over the last few Sundays, 2 Sundays, we've been looking at this whole concept of who goes to heaven and whether being good is really a good enough reason or a good enough way. And we concluded yes, good people go to heaven, just as bad people go to heaven, not because of what they have done, but because of the goodness of Jesus Christ as he died for us on the cross. And this is grace. And we talked about it last Sunday. But if you recall, I also said at the end of my message last Sunday, all this is kind of very interesting. But what happens with all the rules and regulations that somehow seem to be part of the things that we stand for? Okay? All the thou shalt and thou shalt nots isn't really telling us, as you look at the Bible, that we have regulations that we need to kind of keep. We've got rules that we need to adhere to, that we need to obey. Well, yes, that is true. So let's unpack the topic and understand really heaven, who goes there? What about all the rules and regulations? As I said, it's a good question, so let's have a look at it. Now, it is true that there are many parts in the Bible where you will find rules, directions, regulations, and so on. And probably the best well-known section by most people, if they know anything about the Bible, it should be the 10 Commandments. Now, some people swear by them, though probably they wouldn't be able to recite them if eternity depended on that, okay? So what about the 10 Commandments? Do you know where they are? They are in the Bible, okay? Yeah, the Bible, okay, but which part of the Bible? I think it's the first part of the Bible, right? Or is it the end of the Bible? Well, anyway. People talk about the 10 Commandments everywhere. And I felt it'd be good for us to spend just a couple of moments this morning looking at the 10 Commandments. As we consider this question of rules and regulations, which we are supposed to apply to our lives. Now, the 10 Commandments are found in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. And the reason why this book is called Exodus is because it chronicles the ancient exodus of the nation of Israel from Egypt towards what we came to know as the Promised Land. Okay? Some background to that. God called a man named Abraham and said to him, I am going to bless you. You are going to be a blessing not only to those around you, I'm going to make you a great name, and through you the entire world will be blessed. So After the promise, Abram had a family. One of his great-grandsons, Joseph, takes the entire family from where they were living to Egypt because of the famine that they were experiencing. In Egypt, they grew and grew and grew as people. This makes the Pharaoh nervous, makes the entire nation nervous. So they decided, we don't want something getting out of hand. We don't want these people to simply outpopulate us and take over the nation. And so they enslaved all the descendants of Abraham, and they became a slave state within the nation of Egypt. And they remained in that state for over 400 years. And then God moves again, and he calls the man Moses. And Moses goes to the Pharaoh, and this is where I need a bit of participation from the congregation. And he says to the Pharaoh, let my... Ah, lovely, sounds so great. Let my people go. Eventually, Pharaoh did just that and ended up with this epic exodus from Egypt into the wilderness. Now, this is where we need to stop for a couple of seconds to understand some of the background of the Ten Commandments. These people had been a slave state for over 400 years. They had no civil law. They had no constitution. They never functioned independently as a group of people. And there are about 1 million around, or some people would say maybe as much as 2 million people that exit Egypt to follow Moses into the Promised Land. And so God, through Moses, provides for a nation a constitution, laws, civil laws that would protect this nation. Rules to conduct their lives. Remember, they've been slaves for 400 years. And suddenly they are free. They don't know how to act as a nation. And so God gives, in his mercy, gives them the law. And by the way, the law that God gave to Moses was so advanced compared to the laws that existed in other countries. There's really no other explanation for it except being part of the divine plan for this nation. In some cases, there were things in the law that was given to the nation of Israel that don't show up in the history of any other civilization for another 2,000 years. And even today, some of the laws that we have today have been influenced by the laws given to Israel so long ago. So for us this morning, as we're looking at this whole thing of rules and regulations, I really want to bring to you one important fact that is kind of the foundation of what we're talking about. In Exodus, the law that God gives to Moses to give to the people, it doesn't appear until chapter 20. For the first 19 chapters of the book, God is demonstrating his love, his concern, his care for a group of people that he now considered his own people. His people that he had delivered, not because they kept the law, they did not have the law, not because they kept the rules, they did not have the rules. He delivered them pre-law, pre-rules. And do you know why God delivered them from Egypt? Because he wanted to. And that's kind of the bottom line of what we're looking at this morning. When he comes to the God of the Old Testament, when he comes to the God of the New Testament, the God that we worship as Christians, relationship always precedes the rules. Relationship always precedes the rules. God did not give Israel a law by means of establishing a relationship with the nation. God gave Israel the law because they were already in a relationship with him. It wasn't a condition. It was confirmation. They were already part of the family. So for 3 odd months after they leave Egypt, Moses leads them to the foot of Mount Sinai, where God then provides this amazing, detailed constitution, if I can use the word, Lord, in order to guide the people of Israel. And interestingly, it doesn't begin with thou shalt and thou shalt not. Here's the preamble to this ancient constitution. Here's how it starts. I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. In other words, we already have something going on here. There's already a kind of relationship between us. A few months ago, you belonged to Pharaoh. No freedom, no land, no future, no hope. But now you belong to me. And you belong to me without you having had to do anything except one single expression of trust. All that I asked you to do was to put the blood of a lamb on the doorposts of your home as a symbol that you trusted Yahweh. And now that you know that I have your best interest at heart in my mind, I want to give you some rules that will be good for you. And I'm giving them to you not because I'm wanting you to belong to me, but because you already belong to me. And then God gets on with the first command. Here it is. No other gods before me. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And the nation is thinking, that's a no-brainer. No way are we going to have any other gods before us. I mean, we saw what you did to the Egyptian gods. You see, in the ancient day, and even today, there's the mindset that gods were kind of territorial. And so there was a god for every geographical area. And as you move from one area to another, you'd change gods. So wherever you went from one land to another, you just adopted the gods of that land. You could bring your idols. They were kind of visitors to the area. Now, the fact that Yahweh had left wherever he had been, and he was, and showed up in Egypt, and then he wreaked havoc with God after God after God after God, humiliating the entire range of Egyptian gods. That was so mind-blowing for them. Of course, they're not going to have any other gods. You are our God. We've seen what you can do. You are our God. So we'll have no other gods before you. And then out of that flows the next commandment. You will have no idols. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or the earth beneath, or in the waters below. Today we are so used to hearing these words, we just don't give them a second thought. But for the Israelites, for this group of people that had been taken out of Egypt, this was unheard of. It would take another 1,500 years before the next civilization would catch up with this statement of having no idols. So the Lord is saying, look, there are no representations of me. There is nothing that represents me correctly. Therefore, you'll have no idols. Now, the system of worship without an idol, that was just something totally unheard of. It didn't make sense. You just didn't worship without a representation of your gods. In fact, if you know the story, it wasn't long before God gave the law to the people of Israel that they broke it, and they began to worship an idol because they just couldn't figure out how to worship without the idols. But what Yahweh is saying, I am the object of your worship. And there is nothing that you can say or try to explain that will illustrate that you can contain me. And I don't want you to think that if you take an idol that represents me and you set it over there, and then you go somewhere over there, that I'm not there, and so you can do whatever you want. I am not that kind of God. I am the kind of God who is everywhere. So no images, no idols to represent me. Again, it will be almost another 2,000 years before non-Jewish people caught up with this idea of worshipping without idols. God gave a few more commandments to the nation. One example is one that we all know well. When God said, I want you to take a day off. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. Take the day off. What? A day when you don't work. Can't do that. We'll starve. No, you won't. I'll take care of you. For this one day during the week, no work. And by the way, that includes your slaves. The people are saying, obviously we heard that incorrectly. Slaves do not get a day off. They are slaves. God replies, no, you didn't get it wrong. You heard me right. I want you to take 24 hours off every week, and there will be no work at all, and that includes your slaves too. For that day, everybody takes a break. And then again, this was so radical. Today we can't understand the magnitude, the significance of giving all the slaves and the servants a day off. This was something which was totally alien to their way of thinking. It simply was not done. It just didn't happen. But what we see in this commandment is God beginning to teach that every human being is valuable to Him. Everyone has dignity. Everyone matters to God. And so in this ancient law, God is revealing a new ethic, a new value system that was unknown and unheard of. And it was such a stretch that even for the people of Israel, this was simply too difficult to understand. And yet God says, take one day off. And then He continues. And I suppose that the rest of the commandments are basically just how to treat people and to honor them. And so to summarize the rest of the Ten Commandments, it was kind of, honor me because I rescued you, honor others because they are made in my image, and treat slaves with justice because you were once a slave yourself. Do not forget where you came from. But you know, these that we call the Ten Commandments, they are just part of the rules and regulations that God gave to the Israelites. There are over 600 commandments similar to these. Why so many? Because this was their civil law. It had to touch every aspect, every single aspect of their lives. And why did God give them such a detailed system of laws? One simple reason. God cared for His people. The point is simply this. When it comes to God, relationship precedes the rules. The Israelites did not behave their way in. They did not have to be good enough to be accepted by God. And if you read the rest of the Old Testament, you'll find that they were not able to misbehave their way out of the relationship either. I mean, when you start reading the Old Testament and you get to the prophets, it's just this bunch of angry guys ranting and raving and threatening. If you don't change, and if you don't do this, and if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen to you. But in a way, it's a way of God saying to the people, it's a warning, I love you people, okay? I gave you my law so that you'd have the freedom to be able to live the life that I want you to live. All the things that I've given to you are there to protect you and to ensure that you have a good life. But throughout all the rebellion that we find in the Old Testament, through the times when God's people tried to turn their backs on Him, God never abandoned His people. They were His people before He gave them the first thou shalt. They were His people before the rules arrived. What about us today? How does this apply to us today? Because quite often one of the things that is said about the church and about Christianity is that we have so many rules and regulations. You can do this, you can't do this, and so on. What about us today? Well, let me explain it this way. The Apostle Paul was someone who knew both sides of the fence. He was a Pharisee. In fact, he considered himself one of the great Pharisees. He lived by it. Then becomes a follower of Jesus, and he considers himself the chief of sinners. And he says, look, I knew it all. I thought all the rules and regulations, and I was keeping them. I thought they were a way of pleasing God and earning His love and concern for me. But then I met Jesus, and my entire worldview was changed. And this is one of the things that Paul wrote. In Romans 5:8, we read his words, but God showed His great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. Let's just spend a minute or so focusing on these words. Because when we read this verse, especially for those of us who grew up in church and we've heard it so many times, it's okay, we know the meaning. And if you think of it, I wasn't sinning when Christ died for us. I wasn't even alive when that happened. I'm sure it means something important, but I'm not kind of really sure why. Well, let me tell you why this is so important. It's so important to know that Paul wrote these words when Jesus was alive and Paul was alive. Paul's friends, the people that Paul knew were alive when Jesus was crucified. And when that happened, he was nowhere close to the understanding of what God was doing for him. But suddenly Paul realizes, he understands it. I have been 100% wrong about God. I was so wrong that when I heard the message of Jesus, I began to persecute those who believed in Him. I began to do the worst that I could to this group of people. I was wrong. I was in error. I was an enemy of God. And while all this was going on, and while God knew that I would persecute the church, that I would take people to be killed, His Son died for me anyway. While I was still a sinner, while I was still an enemy of God, Christ died for me, and He died for us. 2 verses later, he writes this, for since our friendship with God was restored by the death of His Son, while we were still His enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of His Son. And for us, while we were still enemies of God, while we still thought that we could get to heaven in our own way, while we still thought that we could establish our own rules and regulations, whilst we rebelled against God time and time again, God still loved us. And Christ died for us. He went ahead and reconciled us to Himself. And how did He do it? Through rule keeping and doing our best, making more promises? Paul says no. While we were still sinners, while we were still enemies, God did something for us. He did not require anything from us except to trust Him. So then, why the rules? Well, for Israel, God was not attempting to make bad people good people. God was keeping free people free. And the same is true for you, and the same is true for me. With God, as with all good parents, the relationship always precedes the rules. The rules are simply God's way of saying, because I love you, here's how I want you to live. Because I love you, here's why I want you to forgive others. Because I love you, here's how I want you to serve others. And because I love you, this is how I want you to treat your enemies. And because I love you, this is why I want you to take that log out of your eye and start complaining about what others are doing. Because I love you, and I know what brings the most happiness and fulfillment and peace in your life, I am giving you these rules. Not to prevent you from enjoying life, it's precisely the opposite. I am giving you these rules because I care for you and I want you to have a good life. For those of you who read the Bible in 1 Year devotional on Friday, you'd have come across this illustration as a cartoon of Thomas the Tank Engine. And he's fallen off the tracks and he's lying on his side and he's shouting, I am free at last, I've fallen off the rails and I am free. Of course, reality is that Thomas is far from free when his wheels are off the rails. We all know that he operates at his best when he's doing what has been created to function. And so, we've come to the end of our series, Heaven. Who goes there? And the answer to that question is simply, not those who are good, but those who have put their faith and their trust in Jesus and what Jesus did for them on the cross. And the rules and the regulations, aren't they there to make us good? Nope. When it comes to God, relationship precedes the rules. The rules are there because now that we belong to God, He wants us to experience the type of life that brings the most happiness and fulfillment and peace. Not to get us to go to heaven, but to give us what the Lord Jesus called abundant life. A life of happiness, fulfillment, significance, and peace. I don't know about you, but I'm up for that. Father, thank you that what we're really talking about is not what we have to do, but the fact that you've done something for us. You sent your Son to die for us on the cross, and our forgiveness is found in that. You accepted us as we were. We didn't have to prove ourselves to you. We didn't have to be good enough to be acceptable to you, Lord. And thank you that as our lives are being changed by the power of your Spirit, and you now keep on shaping and molding us to become more and more like your Son, you're doing so not because you are trying to curtail us, but because you know what is best for us. As a good parent, you want us to have the best in this life, Lord. So thank you. Thank you for the freedom that we have in Christ. Thank you for the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross for us. But thank you that you also given us rules that will bring us happiness and joy and peace, fulfillment and significance and purpose in this life. Thank you that you are a caring, loving Father, that is seen in the actions that you take towards us, Lord. And for this, I'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.